A backyard pool is supposed to be a suburban symbol of success and relaxation, but as we're about to see, it's basically just a giant chlorinated trap for people who treat the laws of physics like optional suggestions. Today, we're looking at 10 times a simple desire for convenience turned a standard swimming hole into a final, irreversible biological glitch. Grab your floaties and please, for the love of everything, don't replicate this aquatic idiocy at home. Your local paramedics are already exhausted. 1. Let's talk about the unique brand of delusional confidence that only blooms after 4 domestic Lagers at a suburban 4th of July barbecue. Our first contestant in the Darwin Olympics is a guy we'll call Brad, a 30-something former high school bench warmer who still treated every casual social gathering like an audition for a stuntman gig. Brad possessed that incredibly fatal cocktail of absolutely zero athletic coordination and a complete blindness to his own physical limits. The burgers were gone, the sun was setting, and Brad could physically feel the attention of his peers drifting away, which meant it was time for his grand, unsolicited finale. An epic, gravity-defying double backflip into the deep end of his chlorinated aquatic kingdom. But simply jumping off the solid, predictable concrete edge like a rational human being wasn't flashy enough for a man of his imaginary caliber. He needed maximum airtime to properly showcase his mediocre physique. This brings us to his stroke of absolute anti-genius, raiding his toddler's playroom to enthusiastically extract a brightly colored, absurdly tiny indoor jumping trampoline. Now, if you've ever paid even passing attention to a middle school physics textbook, you might be vaguely aware of Newton's third law of motion, which politely suggests that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Brad blissfully ignored this concept. This miniature toy was engineered with hard plastic feet, specifically designed to grip thick shag carpet, not the slick, puddle-covered ceramic tiles surrounding a swimming pool. Totally deaf to the exasperated groans of his friends and completely ignoring the wet floor, our backyard daredevil positioned his plastic launch pad mere inches from the water's edge and backed up for a dramatic running start. He charged forward like a caffeinated rhino, leaped onto the tiny mesh circle, and drove his legs downward with every ounce of power he possessed to launch himself skyward. This is the exact microsecond the universe decided to ruthlessly enforce the laws of thermodynamics. The immense downward and backward force of Brad's powerful leg thrust, combined with a coefficient of friction of absolutely zero between the wet plastic and the soaked tile, caused the lightweight toy to instantaneously shoot backward across the patio like a greased hockey puck. Suddenly robbed of his entire foundation before he even technically left the ground, Brad's glorious upward trajectory was abruptly canceled. Instead of executing a majestic, rotating arc into the cool water, his entire geographical trajectory simply glitched in midair. He plummeted straight down to violently introduce the back of his skull to the unforgiving right angle of the concrete pool, coping with a permanently final thud. Paramedics arrived to find our would-be acrobat had officially lost his subscription to reality on the deck, having tragically lost a very brief boxing match with basic inertia, while the tiny trampoline sat perfectly unscathed in the hydrangeas 20 feet away. 2. If we were ever forced to hand out a Lifetime Achievement Award for weaponized, catastrophic stubbornness, the undisputed heavyweight champion would be the suburban dad who would rather invent a completely fatal new branch of physics than simply hand over $40 to a professional pool maintenance service. Our aggressively frugal protagonist, a man who viewed writing a check to a local business as a profound personal failure, was staring down the barrel of a deeply neglected 9-foot-deep backyard pool carpeted in a thick layer of rotting autumn leaves. Draining the thousands of gallons of water would severely spike his municipal utility bill, and buying a proper commercial submersible vacuum was entirely out of the question for a guy who refused to buy name-brand ketchup. So he decided to completely bypass common sense and construct a homemade, deeply unhinged deep-sea diving suit out of actual garbage he found, leaning against the wall in his messy garage. His brilliant, money-saving schematic was horrifyingly simple. He took a standard, bright orange plastic 5-gallon utility bucket, flipped it upside down to create an air pocket, and aggressively duct-taped one end of a standard 50-foot rubber garden hose to a hole in the top. The other end of the hose would simply float on the surface, presumably acting as his unlimited magical umbilical cord of fresh oxygen. Because humans are naturally buoyant, and an upside-down bucket full of air desperately wants to float, he needed serious ballast. His solution was to strap on so much random heavy hardware from the garage, rusty dumbbells, old engine parts, a bag of river rocks, using bungee cords and duct tape that he looked less like a DIY diver and more like a human junk drawer that had achieved sentience and immediately made terrible life choices. He confidently waded into the shallow end, placed the orange bucket over his head, and began his slow, heavy descent toward the dark, leafy bottom of the 9-foot deep end. This is where he collided violently with the ruthless reality of hydrostatic pressure. He fundamentally, fatally misunderstood how the human respiratory system actually operates. Your diaphragm is a relatively weak muscle. It simply pulls down to create a vacuum in your lungs so ambient air pressure can push oxygen in. But sitting under 9 vertical feet of heavy water, his chest was being mercilessly crushed by hundreds of pounds of continuous, surrounding liquid pressure. When he finally reached the bottom and tried to take his first victorious breath of hose-delivered air, his diaphragm was utterly, physically incapable of expanding against the immense, crushing weight of the water. He couldn't pull a single molecule of oxygen down that incredibly long, narrow rubber tube. Panic instantly set in, but the heavy cinder block securely knotted to his waist held him firmly to the pool floor, preventing any rapid escape to the surface. He frantically thrashed against his own ridiculous DIY bindings, desperately trying to claw the heavy bucket off his head, but his lungs were practically superglued shut by the immense pressure. His DIY deep-sea adventure reached a permanent, airless finale at the exact bottom of his own backyard pool under a plastic bucket, having successfully sacrificed his own life just to avoid paying a minor convenience fee. 3. What is the absolute maximum amount of effort you would enthusiastically expend just to avoid doing 5 minutes of basic manual labor? For one suburban homeowner whose laziness bordered on actual performance art, the answer involved a spectacular combination of high-voltage landscaping equipment and a blatant disregard for the conductivity of heavily chlorinated water. A man we'll call Doug viewed the simple, traditional pool skimmer net not as a helpful cleaning tool, but as an insulting symbol of archaic peasant labor. He firmly refused to manually fish autumn leaves out of his backyard oasis like some sort of 19th century pioneer. He deeply believed that modern technology should solve all of his problems, which is why he marched into his garage and emerged wielding a heavy-duty, plug-in electric leaf blower. He was absolutely convinced he could just blast the floating debris directly into the filtration system from the comfort of the pool deck. There was just one massive, glaring logistical hurdle in his master plan. His heavy-gauge outdoor extension cord was conveniently missing. This left him with only a frayed, incredibly cheap orange indoor cord that wasn't remotely long enough to reach the designated, weather-protected safety outlets on the patio. Undeterred by standard electrical safety protocols, he simply unspooled the cheap wire through his living room window, plugging it directly into a standard wall socket entirely devoid of those life-saving moisture trip switches. Dragging the live, sputtering hurricane machine out to the backyard, he quickly realized that the angle from the side of the pool wasn't aggressive enough to move the wet leaves. To achieve the perfect aerodynamic trajectory, our suburban genius decided he needed serious elevation, prompting him to march out to the very edge of the fiberglass diving board. Picture the sheer majesty of this moment. A grown man performing a high-wire balancing act on a slick, dripping wet surface, happily revving a 120-volt motorized wind cannon while tethered to a questionable electrical lifeline dangling precariously over a massive body of conductive liquid. He was actually having a great time, blasting a small pile of maple leaves across the surface and mentally congratulating himself for outsmarting the concept of chores entirely. But as he triumphantly took a single step backward to admire his completely leaf-free aquatic kingdom, his heel found the slippery edge of the board. He lost his footing. His arms windmilled in a desperate attempt to find purchase in the empty air, and his right foot kicked out, miraculously looping his ankle straight through the slack of the cheap orange extension cord. As gravity aggressively claimed him and he plummeted backward off the board, he didn't just fall into the water. He forcefully yanked the cord taut, dragging the fully operational, roaring electric leaf blower right off the fiberglass and straight into the deep end with him. The moment the live housing hit the water, The entire pool essentially transformed into a highly conductive, fatal science experiment. Without an outdoor breaker to instantly kill the power, the massive surge of raw household current permanently overloaded his system, turning his brilliant chore avoidance strategy into a shockingly final conclusion while leaving the pool's surface ironically spotless. 4. Have you ever browsed a sketchy overseas discount app at 2 in the morning and thought, wow, this incredibly cheap piece of unregulated plastic looks totally safe? Our undisputed champion of budget-friendly biological disasters is a hyperactive fraternity brother we'll call Tyler, a guy who treated impulse purchasing like an Olympic sport and fundamentally misunderstood how the mammalian respiratory system actually functions. Browsing the internet at 2 in the morning, Tyler stumbled upon a heavily discounted, giant, transparent plastic Zorb ball. For the uninitiated, this is essentially a human-sized hamster wheel designed to let you hilariously run on water. However, a legitimate water-walking sphere costs hundreds of dollars and features complex, breathable air exchange valves so you don't casually suffocate. Tyler's bargain bin death trap, on the other hand, cost roughly the same as a medium pepperoni pizza and possessed the exact same ventilation capabilities as a heavy-duty industrial body bag. Fast forward to a blistering, cloudless Saturday afternoon, with the relentless summer sun mercilessly baking the backyard at a punishing 95 degrees. Tyler, eager to provide the ultimate halftime entertainment for his lethargic, sun-drunk buddies, excitedly shimmies his way inside the deflated plastic sphere. To ensure his pristine vintage sneakers don't get even slightly damp from the pool water, he loudly demands his fraternity brothers zip the thick, heavy-duty waterproof zipper completely shut from the outside. He has essentially just locked himself inside a flawless, impenetrable polymer tomb. His friends happily oblige, kicking the inflated sphere into the deep end, where Tyler immediately begins sprinting like a rabid rodent on a wheel, completely ignorant of two violently unforgiving scientific realities. First, because he opted for the absolute cheapest manufacturing available on the global market, the airtight seal is legitimately spectacular, meaning he has a very finite, rapidly depleting inventory of breathable oxygen. Second, a giant sphere of completely clear, unventilated plastic sitting directly under the punishing midday sun acts exactly like a magnifying glass crossed with a high-efficiency solar oven. Within 5 minutes of his exhausting aquatic marathon, the internal temperature of his personal transparent terrarium skyrockets past 140 degrees, transforming his fun bubble into a floating convection oven with a spectacular view. As Tyler rapidly metabolizes his last few mouthfuls of breathable air into toxic carbon dioxide, his frantic running slows to a pathetic, sweaty crawl. He frantically gasps for oxygen that simply no longer exists, his vision blurring as the relentless greenhouse effect thoroughly overheated his system. He ultimately collapsed face first against the curved plastic wall, succumbing entirely to the extreme temperature and a catastrophic lack of oxygen. And here's the part that really puts the cherry on this plastic catastrophe. As his brain officially shut down and he checked out for good, his deeply inattentive friends sitting on the patio simply pointed and laughed. They genuinely believed he was just taking a hilariously dramatic, entirely dry power nap on the water, leaving his perfectly preserved, completely overheated form bobbing peacefully on the cool surface of the pool for another 20 minutes, before realizing their buddy was officially a permanent pool float. 5. Gravity is an incredibly patient and flawlessly unforgiving teacher, especially when her classroom is a 2-story suburban rooftop and the student is a supremely overconfident guy who treats the physical world like an unskippable tutorial level in a video game. Enter our next architect of his own demise, a backyard adrenaline junkie whose absolute defining personality trait was drinking excessive amounts of caffeinated energy drinks and desperately needing to be the loudest person at any given barbecue. The afternoon festivities had officially reached that deeply dangerous, hey watch this plateau, where rational thought completely evaporates and is replaced by a burning desire to impress people who are barely paying attention. The challenge was beautifully simple in his wildly delusional mind. Haul his massive, full-suspension mountain bike up the carpeted stairs, out the master bedroom window, onto the steeply pitched roof, and execute a glorious, soaring leap directly into the center of the swimming pool. Now, here's a free physics lecture that our hero desperately needed and absolutely refused to attend. When you launch a standard human body off a flat surface, you generally fall in a somewhat predictable arc. But when you solidly attach a heavy 30-pound metal triangle with spinning rubber wheels to your groin, it drastically alters your entire center of mass. He completely failed to calculate that a mountain bike isn't just a magical flying carpet. It's a heavy anchor that desperately wants to rotate downward the absolute microsecond it leaves solid ground. Completely oblivious to this impending aerodynamic disaster, our backyard Evel Knievel enthusiastically pedals hard across the sun-baked asphalt shingles. He picks up a terrifying amount of speed as he launches himself off the aluminum rain gutter, fully expecting to soar through the warm summer air like a majestic aluminum eagle. But the very second his front tire cleared the roofline, physics immediately intervened to spectacularly ruin his weekend. Because he didn't violently pull up on the handlebars to compensate for the massive chunk of metal sitting below him, the heavy front suspension aggressively pitched forward, completely stalling all of his forward momentum. He plummeted straight down like a sack of anvils, separated from his bicycle at the very last second, and slammed face first into the brutal, unyielding concrete of the pool deck with every ounce of momentum that 2 stories of free fall and 30 pounds of metal bicycle could deliver. The devastatingly loud impact of his stunt, fundamentally losing an argument with the pavement, echoed across the suddenly silent backyard. He successfully managed to avoid getting even a single drop of pool water on his clothes, permanently logging off right there on the patio. He left behind a perfectly pristine swimming pool, a horribly mangled bicycle, and a deeply traumatized group of party guests who definitely didn't need to see his impromptu, fatal demonstration of gravitational acceleration. 6. There is a heavily documented inverse relationship between the amount of cheap tequila a human consumes and the financial value they place on their own continued existence. Risking your mortal soul for a crumpled $20 bill truly sets a brand new, terrifying standard for economic desperation. The scene of this particular crime against common sense is a luxury apartment complex pool at 3 in the morning. It was an aquatic oasis that had been strictly barricaded, locked, and drained of all sensible people for scheduled overnight maintenance. The property managers had done everything legally required of them, including erecting prominent warning signs and removing the heavy iron safety grates from the main circulation drains at the bottom of the deep end to swap out some hardware. Crucially, the massive industrial filtration pumps were still actively churning away in the background. Enter a severely intoxicated local resident we'll call Kevin, a man whose entire personality revolved around never backing down from a dare, no matter how profoundly idiotic the stakes. Kevin and his equally inebriated entourage had hopped the wrought iron fence to keep their party going, and as they sat shivering on the edge of the water, a wager was proposed that would permanently alter the local property values. One of his buddies slapped a damp Jackson on the wet concrete and challenged and see if he could successfully plug the gaping hole using nothing but his bare, shirtless torso. We need to take a quick detour into the terrifying mechanics of fluid dynamics and a brutal concept known as delta P, or differential pressure. When a commercial pool pump is relentlessly pulling water through a confined cylinder, it generates hundreds of pounds of continuous, unrelenting suction force. It creates a mechanical trap that simply does not negotiate with human muscle tissue. Oblivious to the invisible industrial vacuum cleaner waiting in the depths, Kevin eagerly accepted the bet, took a massive gulp of air, and swam downward toward the dark, churning opening at the bottom of the basin. With the precision of a guy who truly needed beer money, he maneuvered his chest perfectly over the bare PVC pipe. His success was absolute and instantaneous. The heavy suction immediately grabbed his wet skin, establishing an immaculate, unbreakable hydrostatic seal that violently pinned him flat against the pool floor with the crushing weight of several NFL linebackers. Down in the quiet depths, the horrific reality of the physics lesson finally dawned on him as his desperate, thrashing attempts to simply bench press himself off the drain proved mathematically impossible. He was bolted to the concrete by the very water he was swimming in. Meanwhile, up on the surface, his attention-deficient friends giggled for about 90 seconds before getting entirely distracted by a funny video on someone's phone, assuming Kevin had just quietly swum away to dry off in the bushes. They eventually wandered back to their apartments to sleep off the alcohol, leaving their buddy functionally transformed into a permanent biological drain plug, where his underwater marathon reached a permanent tragic conclusion in the silent depths, hopelessly wrestling a machine that didn't even know he existed. 7. Meet Gary. Gary was a fiercely impatient suburban dad who genuinely believed that simply owning a toolbox instantly qualified him as a master of industrial chemistry. He viewed reading standard warning labels as a direct insult to his masculine intellect and treated basic safety protocols like optional suggestions for cowards. Gary's backyard pool had gradually mutated into a swampy, fluorescent green biological hazard over the long winter. And instead of calling a professional or simply following the manufacturer's incredibly explicit, heavily bolded instructions, he decided to completely reinvent the science of water purification. He was absolutely determined to execute a massive, time-saving, super shock treatment to annihilate the algae in one single, aggressively toxic swoop. He confidently marched into his cramped, unventilated, sweltering hot garage, which was already a claustrophobic nightmare of lawnmowers and rusty paint cans. Rummaging around in the dark, he uncovered a chaotic graveyard of half-used pool chemical containers. Different brands, different formulas, some with labels so sun-faded they were basically abstract art. Now, anyone who has ever glanced at the back of a pool chemical container knows that rule number 1, printed in enormous capital letters, is to absolutely never, under any circumstances, mix different chlorine products together. They look the same, they smell roughly the same, but certain combinations despise each other on a molecular level. But Gary, operating on pure hubris and a scorching desire to get back to his football game, treated every warning label like junk mail. Instead of carefully adding one product at a time to fresh water like a functioning adult, he grabbed an old bucket and started dumping multiple containers of completely different, chemically incompatible pool treatments into the same vessel. To really maximize his catastrophic megadose, he grabbed the wooden handle of a dirty snow shovel and started vigorously grinding the mismatched compounds together, essentially performing the world's most suicidal chemistry experiment right next to his wife's minivan. The bucket almost immediately went critical, erupting in a blinding, hissing white cloud of searing heat and overwhelmingly toxic fumes that rapidly expanded to fill every square inch of the cramped garage, filling the space faster than his oxygen-deprived brain could locate the door handle. Before his brain could even process the colossal magnitude of his mistake or send a panic signal to his legs to run, the overwhelmingly toxic gas violently hit his respiratory system. The fumes instantly overwhelmed his upper airways and completely neutralized his internal systems, entirely robbing him of the mechanical ability to process oxygen. Gary's legs buckled under the sheer shock of the chemical assault, and he collapsed face-first directly into his own bubbling, sputtering bucket of doom. The toxic fumes claimed his last breath right there on the greasy concrete floor, proving that skipping 15 minutes of reading can, in fact, cost you everything, while his swimming pool remained entirely, spectacularly green. 8. When the temperature drops below freezing, the average backyard swimming pool transforms into a desolate, icy wasteland, securely hidden beneath a heavy-duty winter tarp, which is essentially a tightly stretched vinyl drum that serves as nature's most unforgiving mechanical trap. Our next casualty of impatience is a guy we'll call Derek, a man whose entire existence was dictated by an absolute refusal to experience even a microsecond of minor inconvenience. It was the absolute dead of January, and while hurriedly taking out the trash, Derek's frozen fingers fumbled, causing his wildly expensive, irreplaceable electronic keys for his imported sports car to slide out of his grasp. They bounced across the frozen patio and landed squarely in the dead center of his heavily sagging, waterlogged, debris-covered winter pool cover. Now, a rational human being would simply walk back to the warm garage, grab a 15-foot aluminum skimmer pole, and gently fish the keys out from the safety of the deck. But Derek didn't have time for sensible problem-solving. He had a very important tea time at an indoor golf simulator. Surveying the frozen, swampy landscape of the tarp, he made the spectacularly idiotic calculation that the semi-frozen layer of icy slush resting on top of the vinyl was totally solid enough to support a grown man's weight. So, dressed in an expensive, heavy winter coat and thick boots, Derek dropped to his stomach and began awkwardly army crawling out onto the suspended, slippery abyss. He made it about halfway, blatantly ignoring the ominous, groaning sounds of the heavy vinyl, visibly stretching under his 190-pound frame. Right as his fingertips brushed the metal keychain, his heavy winter boots slipped violently on a slick patch of black ice. His sudden, thrashing panic shifted his center of gravity too far to the left, putting catastrophic pressure on a section of the tarp where the metal safety anchors had quietly rusted and popped loose weeks ago. The heavy cover suddenly gave way. Derek slid instantly off the icy top layer and plunged straight into the pitch-black 30-degree water underneath. The sheer terror of the freezing water instantly shocked his system, but the real nightmare was just beginning. The moment his body broke the surface and pushed the tarp down, the immense weight of the water and ice resting on top of the cover immediately snapped the heavy vinyl completely shut right over his head. He had successfully deposited himself into an impenetrable vacuum-sealed aquatic coffin. The heavy, unyielding material tightly molded perfectly to the surface of the water above him, completely eliminating any trace of a breathable air pocket. Flailing wildly in absolute freezing darkness, Derek desperately tried to punch and claw his way upward, but fighting against the immense hydrostatic pressure of a weighted winter cover from underneath is physically like trying to bench press a parked cement truck. He was completely trapped in a pitch-black, freezing aquatic tomb, ultimately reaching a permanently fatal, airless conclusion while his pristine sports car sat completely unharmed in the driveway. 9. The modern social media ecosystem is basically a digital gladiator arena, where grown adults will gladly trade their basic survival instincts for a brief spike in algorithmic engagement. Enter Chase, a hyperactive content creator who firmly believed his path to internet immortality required abandoning his evolutionary right to bipedal locomotion. Chase wasn't a freediver. His primary cardiovascular exercise consisted of unboxing cheap electronics. Yet, he decided to capitalize on a viral aquatic aesthetic by ordering a knockoff, solid silicone mermaid tail from a sketchy discount app. This was not professional theatrical equipment. It was essentially a 30-pound neon purple rubber straitjacket designed to violently fuse your legs together from the pelvic bone down to the toes. Here is a brutally sarcastic lesson in basic physics. Remaining oxygenated in deep water relies entirely on the independent, alternating thrust of two separate legs. If you willingly vacuum seal your lower half into a dense, unyielding polymer cone, you neutralize your ability to tread water, meaning your survival depends entirely on executing a flawless, core-devastating dolphin kick. Chase's core strength was roughly equivalent to a wet paper towel. Undeterred by his total lack of abdominal muscles, he spent an agonizing hour on the concrete, awkwardly wriggling into the suffocating silicone tube. To guarantee maximum cinematic tragedy, he stubbornly gripped a heavy aluminum camera rig with both hands, ensuring his arms were entirely useless for emergency paddling. Waddling to the edge of his 10-foot deep end, with the grace of a medicated walrus, Chase flashed a doomed smile and launched his tightly bound body into the chlorinated abyss. The instant he broke the surface, the comedic stunt violently mutated into a fatal hostage situation. The cheap silicone offered zero buoyancy, acting instead like a glamorous anchor tied directly to his waist. As his head slipped beneath the surface, Chase instinctively commanded his legs to execute a standard scissor kick, only to discover his lower limbs were hopelessly paralyzed inside an unyielding rubber prison. Primal panic hijacked his brain. He dropped the heavy camera rig, desperately clawing at his waist to peel the thick silicone off his thighs. However, cheap silicone doesn't stretch the same way when it's soaking wet. The material clung to his skin like industrial shrink wrap, and without any solid ground to brace against, peeling skin-tight rubber off your own legs while simultaneously drowning is about as effective as trying to take off skinny jeans during an earthquake. Without the mechanical ability to separate his legs, his frantic thrashing only rapidly burned through his severely limited oxygen supply while accelerating his descent. He sank straight to the bottom like a bedazzled stone, silently expiring on the concrete floor while hopelessly trapped inside a customized aquatic trap of his own making. The spectacularly bleak irony of this mythical tragedy? His heavy camera drifted down and landed perfectly upright on the pool floor just a few feet away, flawlessly recording high-definition footage of Chase looking absolutely majestic, forever trapped in his own discount rubber skin and unmistakably deceased. 10. Picture a minimalist, high-end Mediterranean luxury resort, absurdly crammed into a suburban backyard. It's an architectural marvel, and usually the exact place where overwhelming arrogance collides with shallow water. Our final maestro of misery was a deeply pretentious, insufferably wealthy homeowner who had just poured a small fortune into completely renovating his backyard to resemble a minimalist, high-end Mediterranean luxury resort. He was absolutely obsessed with clean lines, neutral tones, and a total absence of visual clutter. However, his incredibly expensive contractor had legally forced him to install bright, garish, safety yellow and red signs directly into the pristine concrete that read, "No diving, extreme shallow water." These highly necessary, legally mandated warnings were positioned right next to his newly installed, ultra-trendy Baja shelf, a massive, sprawling designer tanning ledge specifically lined with beautiful dark ocean blue mosaic tiles. Now, the entire architectural point of using dark tiles is to create a stunning optical illusion of immense, endless depth, despite the fact that the ledge actually holds exactly 6 measly inches of water resting directly over solid, unforgiving concrete. Pacing his patio before his massive backyard reveal party, our homeowner looked at the bright red safety signs and decided they totally ruined his highly curated Zen-like aesthetic. Armed with a socket wrench and a lethal dose of absolute vanity, he furiously unbolted the warning markers, violently hurled them into the garbage, and admired his newly unobstructed, flawlessly minimalist view. Fast forward a few hours, the expensive imported champagne is flowing, the guests are mingling, and our arrogant host is desperately feeling the sudden need to remind everyone that he was once a mildly successful high school springboard diver 2 decades ago. Pointing to the massive, dark blue expanse of his brand-new Baja shelf, he confidently announces a dramatic demonstration of his athletic prowess. He takes a long, highly theatrical running start across the expensive, imported travertine tiles, leaps majestically into the air, and executes a genuinely flawless, picture-perfect swan dive, conveniently forgetting the architectural lie he paid $40,000 to install. His brain fully anticipated slicing cleanly through 8 vertical feet of refreshing, deep blue water. Instead, he soared through the warm summer air in perfect aerodynamic form and abruptly introduced his soaring trajectory directly to the absolute reality of 6 inches of water sitting on top of reinforced gunite. The devastatingly sudden, abrupt halt of his momentum instantly silenced the entire party. His architectural miscalculation resulted in a permanently fatal stop as his grand finale came to a completely motionless halt on the ultra-expensive tanning ledge before anyone could even put down their drinks. The responding paramedics noted that while his stunt ended in total, irreversible physical disaster, his pristine, highly curated, completely sign-free minimalist aesthetic remained absolutely, undeniably gorgeous. After reviewing these 10 cases, one thing is clear. The motivation to act was almost always a small, everyday problem. Do you think these people were just unlucky? Or is there a fundamental design flaw in the human brain that makes us underestimate backyard hazards? Drop your thoughts below. Smash that like button, subscribe, and let's discuss the psychology of the minor risk